Most people will never know what they are actually made of, not because they lack courage or intelligence or talent, but because they have never been forced or have never forced themselves to find out they operate somewhere between 40 and 60% of their real capacity, and they mistake that ceiling for who they are. They confuse their comfort zone with their character. And the tragedy is that everything they are looking for, the confidence, the discipline, the sense of self that cannot be rattled, is sitting on the other side of the suffering they have been avoiding. Today's guest has spent his entire life proving that the other side exists and building a map for how to get there. Welcome to the Huberman Lab podcast, where we discuss science and science-based tools for everyday life. I am Andrew Huberman, and I am a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. My guest today is David Goggins. David is a retired Navy SEAL, the only member of the United States Armed Forces in history to have completed Navy SEAL training, Army Ranger School, and Air Force Tactical Air Controller training. He is an ultra-endurance athlete who has competed in more than 70 ultra-distance events, has finished in the top 5 of many of them, and set the Guinness World Record for pull-ups. He is the author of 2 books, Can't Hurt Me and Never Finished, both of which have reached millions of people worldwide. And he is, without question, one of the most psychologically singular individuals I have ever had the opportunity to speak with. What David has done is not just physical. He has built a philosophy of self-construction from some of the most brutal raw material imaginable, and he has developed a set of practices and frameworks for inner strength that are specific enough to be immediately actionable by anyone listening today. I want to be clear about what today's conversation is about. It is not about extremism. It is not about glorifying suffering for its own sake. It is about something much more important and much more applicable, which is the question of how any human being develops a relationship with themselves that is honest enough, disciplined enough, and resilient enough to allow them to become who they are genuinely capable of being. That question turns out to have answers, and David has found some of the most powerful ones. Timestamps are in the description below. Before we get into the conversation, I want to briefly thank our sponsors. Without further ado, my conversation with David Goggins. I want to begin where everything about David Goggins begins, which is the origin, because one of the things I find most important about understanding how David built the psychology he has built is understanding what he built it from. Not despite the circumstances of his early life, but in many respects because of how he chose to relate to those circumstances. And I think this matters enormously for anyone listening, because most people look at what David has achieved and conclude that he must be wired differently, that some unusual capacity arrived with him. And I think that conclusion, while understandable, is both wrong and costly, because if David's toughness is innate, then you cannot develop it. And if you cannot develop it, you have a built-in excuse for not trying. So let us go to the beginning. David Goggins was born on the 17th of February, 1975 in Buffalo, New York. His father, Twenties Goggins, owned a roller skating rink called Skateland in East Buffalo. From the outside, that sounds like a reasonable childhood. From the inside, it was, in David's own words, hell on earth. Beginning at age 6, David, his mother Jackie, and his brother Twenties Jr. were required to work the night shift at Skateland, organizing skates, cleaning the facility, doing whatever needed doing until the early hours of the morning. They slept on a couch in the back office. They missed school. They missed childhood. And the threat of violence was constant. David's father was physically and emotionally abusive in ways that go well beyond what most people can imagine. The abuse was not occasional. It was systematic. A missing pair of skates meant a beating with a belt. Witnessing what his mother endured meant learning at an age when most children are learning to read, that the world inside the family home was a place where physical safety could not be assumed. The neuroscience of what this does to a child's developing nervous system is significant. Research on adverse childhood experiences, the ACE studies conducted by doctors Vincent Felitti and Robert Anda and published originally in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine, documented the relationship between childhood trauma and adult outcomes with remarkable specificity. Children who experience high numbers of adverse childhood experiences, including abuse, domestic violence, and household dysfunction, show measurably altered stress response systems. The HPA axis, which regulates cortisol release in response to perceived threat, becomes calibrated to a threat environment. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, develops heightened reactivity, and the prefrontal cortex, whose development requires the kind of safe, exploratory engagement with the world that a secure childhood provides, is deprived of the conditions it needs to develop optimally. What this means in practice is that a child growing up in David Goggins' early environment is learning at a neurological level that the world is dangerous, that people in positions of power are threats, and that hypervigilance is the appropriate default state. These are not irrational conclusions given the actual environment. They are adaptive responses. The problem is that those adaptations persist well beyond the environment that created them, shaping behavior and inner experience in ways the adult is often not fully aware of. When David was 8 years old, his mother, Jackie, managed to escape with him to Brazil, Indiana, her hometown. His brother, Trunnis Jr., made the choice to return to Buffalo to live with their father, a decision that would separate the brothers and add another layer of loss to David's early experience. Brazil, Indiana in the 1980s was a small, largely white rural town. And David, a black child arriving in a community where the Ku Klux Klan had a local presence, found that leaving one form of danger did not mean arriving at safety. He experienced open, explicit racism. He found a note in his Spanish notebook that read, in explicit terms, that he and people who looked like him would be killed. When he was 16, someone spray painted a racial slur on the door of his car, and he was the only black student at his school in many contexts, which meant carrying a social isolation on top of everything else. The academic consequences of his early life also became visible in Indiana. Because of the night shifts at Skateland, David had essentially missed the foundational years of his education. He could barely read. He could not do basic mathematics with competence. He was diagnosed with a learning disability in the 3rd grade, a diagnosis that in his case reflected not a neurological limitation, but the consequences of chronic sleep deprivation, toxic stress, and missed schooling. His stutter, which developed as a physical manifestation of chronic fight-or-flight activation, made school a social gauntlet. Speaking in class meant the risk of being mocked. And being mocked activated the same threat response that abuse had wired into his nervous system. He developed severe social anxiety. He started losing patches of hair. White splotches appeared on his skin, which are consistent with alopecia areata and vitiligo, both of which have documented associations with chronic psychological stress. And he began to cheat on his schoolwork, not from laziness, but from desperation, because cheating was the only strategy available to him for managing the gap between what was expected of him and what his circumstances had actually prepared him to do. This is the raw material, and I want to sit with it for a moment before moving forward, because I think it is essential for understanding everything that came after. Most people who experienced what David experienced in his first 16 years of life would carry those experiences as explanations for limitation, as reasons why they could not do things, could not be things, could not expect things. The research on adverse childhood experiences supports this. The correlation between high ACE scores and adult outcomes, including substance abuse, mental illness, cardiovascular disease, and reduced life expectancy, is real and robust. The average trajectory for someone beginning where David began is not a Navy SEAL. The average trajectory is significantly worse than average. David did not come from a different starting line. He started from a deeper deficit than most people can fully appreciate. And he built what he built, not by pretending the deficit was not real, but by turning and facing it with a honesty that most people never apply to themselves, even under infinitely more comfortable circumstances. After high school, David joined the Air Force, specifically the pararescue program. He went through the initial phase of pararescue training and was found to have sickle cell trait, which led to him being removed from the program. He left the Air Force and entered what he describes as the darkest period of his life. He was working as a pest control exterminator, spraying cockroaches in restaurants late at night. He was eating for comfort. He reached 297 pounds, and he was pre-diabetic. He was, in his own honest accounting, completely lost. And then one night he sat down in front of his television and watched a documentary about Navy SEAL training, about Bud S., about Hell Week. And something happened that is worth examining carefully, because it was not simply inspiration. Motivation comes and goes. This was something different. It was a recognition. David looked at those men, at what they were enduring and what they were becoming through that endurance, and he recognized something he had been looking for since he was 6 years old, working the night shift at a roller skating rink, a way to build a self that could not be taken apart, a way to forge something inside that could not be beaten out of him. He stood up and walked to the bathroom mirror. And what happened next was not motivational. It was surgical. He looked at himself at 297 pounds, at a man who had been told his whole life through word and circumstance that he was not enough, and he told himself the truth. Not a comforting truth. Not a truth designed to make him feel better. The actual, unvarnished, specific truth about where he was, how he had gotten there, and what he was going to have to do about it. This moment, which he would later describe as the founding of what he calls the accountability mirror, is the beginning of everything. And I want to examine it from the neuroscience perspective, because what David stumbled onto through necessity is something that the research on self-regulation, identity change, and behavior change independently validates. The psychological concept most relevant here is what researchers call self-confrontation. Albert Bandura's work on self-efficacy and self-regulation established that accurate self-assessment is the foundation of genuine behavioral change, not optimistic self-assessment. Not pessimistic self-assessment, accurate assessment. The research shows that people who hold inflated self-assessments, who believe they are doing better than they are, show reduced motivation to improve, because the discrepancy between current reality and desired reality that drives change is artificially minimized. And people who hold catastrophically negative self-assessments become paralyzed because the gap between current reality and possible reality appears unbridgeable. The optimal state for behavioral change is what researchers call the accurate discrepancy, a clear-eyed perception of where you actually are, a clear vision of where you want to be, and the belief that the gap is bridgeable through action. What David was doing in that bathroom mirror was constructing the accurate discrepancy. He was refusing both the comfortable lies that had allowed him to stay where he was and the catastrophizing that could have told him it was too late. He was looking at exactly what was true and deciding to act from that truth. The specifics of what David Goggins did next are important, not just as a biographical detail, but as a framework for understanding what it actually takes to change a life that has been shaped by forces as powerful as the ones that shaped his. He had to lose 106 pounds in 3 months to qualify for the Navy SEAL weight requirement, 106 pounds in 90 days. He was not starting from a position of athletic fitness. He was starting from pre-diabetic obesity with no real training foundation, no coach, no program, no community. What he had was the clarity he had found in front of that mirror and the decision he had made. He ran, he biked, he swam, he restricted his calories. He did this every day in whatever physical condition he was in, regardless of how he felt. And the critical thing I want to draw your attention to is that he did not rely on motivation to do it. Motivation, as David has said directly and repeatedly, is unreliable. It is an emotional state that arrives when conditions are favorable and disappears when conditions are not. What David was building was something categorically different, which is what he calls being driven. And being driven is not a feeling. It is a decision that has been made so completely and so repeatedly that it no longer requires the same decision to be made again each morning. It becomes the operating system rather than an app running on top of it. The neuroscience of this distinction is real. Research on goal pursuit and self-regulation shows that the most effective goal pursuit is characterized by what psychologists call implementation intentions, which are specific, predetermined responses to anticipated obstacles. When X happens, I will do Y. When the alarm goes off, I will get up and run. When I feel like quitting at mile 15, I will remember why I started. The specificity of these implementation intentions converts effortful, conscious decision-making into something closer to automatic behavioral execution. And the repetition of these behavioral sequences in consistent contexts, as I discussed in a previous episode on habit formation, progressively transfers control from the prefrontal cortex to the basal ganglia, making the behavior more automatic and less dependent on moment-to-moment motivational state. David was building neural infrastructure for driven behavior, not relying on the emotional weather of motivation. And the fact that he did this while simultaneously undergoing physical transformation of a radical degree, while dealing with the physiological consequences of rapid weight loss and unaccustomed physical training, is a demonstration of how much the human system can do when the decision at the center of it is real. He made the weight, he passed the initial screening, and then he went to Bud S. Navy SEAL Basic Underwater Demolition and SEAL Training is considered one of the most demanding military training programs in existence. Hell Week, which occupies approximately the third week of the first phase of BUD-S, involves approximately 5.5 days of continuous training with an average of about 4 hours of sleep total for the entire week, cold water immersion, timed runs and swims in sand and ocean, log physical training, surf torture. The psychological design of Hell Week is specifically intended to break people because the Navy needs to know that the people who become SEALs have the psychological architecture to function when every biological system in the body is screaming to stop. The dropout rate during BUD-S is approximately 70 to 80%. Most people who begin SEAL training do not finish it, and the people who do not finish are not weak in any conventional sense. They are military volunteers who made it through the screening process. They are, by almost any measure, exceptional, and they still quit. What separates the people who finish from those who do not is not, in David's analysis, primarily physical. It is psychological. Specifically, it is the relationship a person has with the voice in their head that tells them to stop. David went through Hell Week. He went through it with a stress fracture in his foot that he concealed from the medical staff because he knew that disclosure would mean removal from training. He went through it with pneumonia, he completed Hell Week, and then he failed the next phase and had to return to start over. He went through Hell Week a second time, he failed again. The specific failures are less important than what they required of him psychologically. He had to come back again and stand at the beginning of something he had already endured and failed twice, knowing exactly what was coming, and choose to do it again. This is a quality that David describes as the foundation of the psychological architecture he spent his life building, and it is the quality most missing from most people's relationship with their own goals. The willingness to fail, to acknowledge the failure clearly and specifically rather than minimizing it, to extract everything the failure can teach, and to return, not with false confidence, not with a pretense that this time will be easier, but with the honest knowledge of exactly what is coming and the decision to proceed anyway. He went through Hell Week a third time. He finished, he graduated from BUD-S with class 235 in 2001. He then went on to complete Army Ranger School, becoming one of the only people in history to complete all 3 of the elite training programs he has completed. He served for 20 years in the military, including deployment to Iraq and Afghanistan. He lost friends in the 2005 helicopter crash in Afghanistan during Operation Red Wings that killed 8 Navy SEALs, 19 service members in total, which remains one of the worst losses of special operations forces in American military history. The grief of those losses and the guilt that survivors of such events often carry is something David has spoken about with the same honesty he brings to everything else. It is part of the accounting he has done with his life, not something to be packaged or managed away. After the military, David entered the world of ultra-endurance athletics. And here I want to address something important about why he did this, because I do not think it is adequately understood. David did not run ultramarathons to test his physical limits, though that was part of it. He ran them to continue the practice that BUD-S had given him. The practice of going to the edge of what he believed was possible and discovering that the edge was not where he thought it was. The 40% rule, which is one of his most widely discussed concepts, emerged from this practice. The rule states that when your mind tells you that you are done, when the sensation of exhaustion and pain tells you that you have given everything you have, you are actually only at approximately 40% of your true capacity. The remaining 60% is still available, but it is on the other side of the moment you choose to quit. This is not an arbitrary number. David arrived at it through experience, through systematically testing the point at which he believed he was finished and discovering what was still available past that point. And the neuroscience of fatigue provides context for why this might be true. Research by Samuel Marcora and his colleagues at the University of Kent on the psychobiology of endurance has shown that perception of effort, what researchers call rating of perceived exertion, is a central regulator of endurance performance. And crucially, perception of effort is not a direct read of the physiological state. It is a construction of the brain influenced by motivation, by attention, by the interpretation of bodily signals, and by prior experience. Studies have shown that people can sustain significantly more physical output when they are unaware of how far they have already gone than when they are given accurate information about their progress. The brain, in other words, regulates effort based on incomplete information about actual physiological capacity, and it errs on the side of stopping before the system is truly exhausted. The margin between the perceived limit and the actual limit is real, and it is significant. David has spent decades training in that margin. Now, I want to go deep on the specific psychological tools David has developed because this is the part of today's conversation that is most directly applicable to everyone listening. These are not methods for becoming a Navy SEAL. They are methods for developing a relationship with yourself that is capable of supporting genuine change and genuine growth, regardless of where you start or what you are trying to build. The first and most fundamental tool is what David calls the accountability mirror. The concept is simple in description and extremely demanding in practice. You stand in front of a mirror and you have a completely honest conversation with yourself about where you actually are, not where you wish you were, not where you tell other people you are, where you actually are. Your physical condition, your financial situation, your relationships, the habits you have been meaning to change for months or years, the things you know you are avoiding, the ways you have been lying to yourself. You put these things on paper, often literally on Post-it notes on the mirror, so that every time you stand in front of it, you are confronted with the actual inventory of your life rather than the version your ego prefers. And you commit to specific, concrete actions that address those specific, concrete realities. Not vague intentions, not general goals, specific behaviors that you will perform on specific days. The accountability mirror is not a tool for self-punishment. It is a tool for self-respect. David makes a distinction that I think is important here. Real self-compassion is not telling yourself comfortable things to make you feel better. Real self-compassion is telling yourself the truth because you respect yourself enough to believe you can handle it and act on it. The soft, self-soothing approach to self-talk that much of modern personal development promotes is, in his view, a form of giving up on yourself disguised as kindness. The data on this distinction is actually interesting from a research standpoint. A 2010 meta-analysis by David Dunning and colleagues on the Dunning-Kruger effect and self-assessment accuracy found that people who receive honest, specific negative feedback about performance show greater subsequent improvement than people who receive inflated positive feedback, as long as the negative feedback is accompanied by information about what to do differently. Honest confrontation, when paired with a path forward, produces better outcomes than comfortable avoidance. The second tool is what David calls callousing the mind. And I want to explain this concept with precision because I think it is often misunderstood. Callousing the mind does not mean becoming numb to difficulty. It does not mean shutting down the experience of discomfort. It means doing the opposite, which is deliberately and regularly entering uncomfortable situations so that discomfort loses its power to stop you. The mechanism is neurological. The brain habituates to repeated stimuli. A stimulus that produces a significant stress response on first encounter produces progressively less response with repeated exposure in the absence of actual harm through a process called habituation at the level of the amygdala and HPA axis. This is the neurological basis of systematic desensitization in the treatment of anxiety disorders. What David has essentially designed is a systematic desensitization program for the experience of physical and psychological discomfort at the level of his entire life. And the result is that the stimuli that would stop most people, the physical pain of a 100-mile race, the psychological pain of public failure, the discomfort of extreme cold or extreme heat or extreme fatigue, no longer stop him because he has habituated to them through deliberate, repeated exposure. The practical application of this for anyone listening is not to go run 100 miles. It is to identify the specific areas of your life where discomfort is currently serving as a stop sign, and to begin making contact with that discomfort deliberately on your terms in controlled doses that gradually increase. The gym is one arena for this. Cold exposure is another. Difficult conversations are a third. Attempting things you are not sure you can do. The content of the discomfort matters less than the practice of meeting it rather than avoiding it. The third tool is what David calls the cookie jar. This is a mental tool for sustaining performance when the present moment becomes overwhelming. The cookie jar is a mental inventory of your most significant past achievements and the hardest things you have ever survived or accomplished. Specific memories stored in enough detail that you can access the felt sense of them, not just the abstract fact of them. The time you finished something you thought you could not finish. The time you kept going when every part of you was demanding you stop. The time you survived something that seemed unsurvivable. When you are in a current moment of maximum difficulty, you reach into the cookie jar and you pull out one of those memories. You use the evidence of your past resilience to remind yourself in real time that you have been to hard places before and you have come back. This is not wishful thinking. It is evidence-based self-regulation. The research on self-efficacy, Albert Bandura's term for the belief in your own capacity to execute the behaviors required to produce specific outcomes, shows that past mastery experience is the single most powerful source of self-efficacy. When you can recall in vivid detail that you have done hard things, your belief in your capacity to do the next hard thing is calibrated to reality rather than to fear. David has spent decades filling his cookie jar, and the practice of filling it continues with every difficult thing he takes on. The completion of each hard thing is not just an achievement in itself. It is a deposit into the store of evidence about what he is capable of, that he can draw on in future hard moments. The fourth tool is what David calls taking souls. And this one deserves careful explanation because it sounds more aggressive than its actual application warrants. Taking souls is a competitive cognitive strategy for use in situations where you are in direct competition with others or where you are being evaluated by people who doubt you. It means deciding that you will be so fully present, so completely committed to your performance in this specific moment, that you will surpass every expectation of you to such a degree that the competition or the doubters or the evaluators are psychologically affected by what they are witnessing. In practical terms, it means going to a completely different level, not just doing well, doing so far beyond what is expected that the frame of reference shifts. David developed this strategy partly in response to the doubt and low expectations that surrounded him throughout his early life. Racism, poverty, learning disability, obesity. He was told explicitly and implicitly that he was not capable of extraordinary things. Taking souls is the practice of using that doubt as fuel, of converting external skepticism into internal drive, of making the act of proving the doubters wrong the source of energy in moments when his own internal resources were running low. The psychology here is interesting. Research on what is called motivational opponent process theory suggests that aversive emotional states, including the emotion of being underestimated or doubted, can be converted into motivational fuel through cognitive reappraisal. The key is the reappraisal step. The doubt itself is not motivating. The interpretation of the doubt as a challenge rather than as a judgment is what converts it into drive. David has made that reappraisal essentially automatic through decades of practice. The fifth tool, and I consider this perhaps the most neurologically sophisticated of his practices, is what David calls the governor. The governor is the voice in the head that tells you to stop. It is not the voice of wisdom. It is not the voice of genuine injury or real danger. It is the voice of the brain's threat management system, which is calibrated to avoid discomfort rather than to maximize capacity. Every human brain has a governor. Its job is to prevent you from going to the edge of your real capacity because the edge is uncomfortable and uncomfortable feels like danger. David has spent his life learning to hear the governor's voice, identify it precisely as the governor rather than as wisdom or genuine limitation, and override it. This is not a simple skill. It requires the development of self-awareness precise enough to distinguish between real signals of injury or danger, which should be heeded, and the governor's false signals of danger that are actually signals of uncomfortable effort. That distinction is something that develops through experience and through the specific practice of going to the edge repeatedly and observing what is actually there. What David has found consistently is that the edge the governor claims is the real limit is not the real limit, that there is capacity past it, and that accessing that capacity requires nothing more or less than the decision to ignore the governor and keep going. I want to address the question of pain directly because I think it is one of the most commonly misunderstood aspects of David's philosophy. The misunderstanding goes like this. David Goggins glorifies pain and advocates suffering for its own sake. This is not what he actually believes or practices. What he actually believes is this. Pain is information. Specifically, it is information about the boundary of your current capacity. And the boundary of your current capacity is not who you are. It is where you are right now, given the training you have done, the life you have lived, the self you have built so far. That boundary is not fixed. It expands in direct proportion to the deliberate contact you make with it. So pain at the edge of your capacity is not your enemy. It is your teacher. It is showing you exactly where the next phase of growth is located. This is a profoundly different relationship to pain than most people have. Most people treat pain as a stop sign. Full stop. The practice ends. David treats it as a marker, as a data point that says, here is where you currently are. Now, what do you choose to do with that information? This brings me to the neuroscience of something that I want to address directly, which is the relationship between physical pain endurance and psychological resilience. Because one of the things that David's approach implicitly claims is that developing the capacity to endure physical discomfort changes the capacity to endure psychological discomfort. And the research on this, while not exhaustively developed, is consistent with that claim. Studies on what is called pain tolerance and its relationship to general self-regulatory capacity have shown that people who voluntarily undergo painful experiences, cold water immersion protocols, grip strength endurance tasks, high-intensity exercise to volitional failure, develop not just higher pain tolerance for those specific stimuli, but a more generalized relationship to uncomfortable experience that includes psychological discomfort. The mechanism is likely through the prefrontal cortical control of the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula, both of which are involved in the affective component of pain, meaning the unpleasantness of it rather than just its sensory intensity. When you practice maintaining prefrontal engagement and behavioral continuation in the presence of uncomfortable sensory experience, you are training the neural circuits of emotional regulation in a very direct way. You are developing the capacity to feel something difficult and not be controlled by it, and that capacity generalizes. I also want to address the self-reflection practice that David developed, which goes deeper than the accountability mirror, and which I consider one of the most powerful and least discussed aspects of what he has built. David describes a practice of what I would call radical self-interrogation, not self-criticism in the destructive, ruminating sense, but a specific analytical examination of his own behavior, motivation, and response patterns that is as demanding and as honest as any external examination could be. After any significant performance or failure, he asks specific questions. What actually happened? What was I thinking and feeling at the moments that mattered? Where did I make the choices that led to this outcome? What did I not want to see or admit about what was happening? What am I still not wanting to see right now? This last question is the most important one and the hardest one, because the things we are currently most invested in not seeing are the things that have the most influence over our behavior, precisely because we cannot see them. David's willingness to go into that territory, to apply the same relentless confrontational energy to his inner life that he applies to a 100-mile race, is, in my view, the deepest source of what he has built. The research on introspective accuracy and psychological growth is relevant here. Work on what James Pennebaker at the University of Texas has called expressive writing, the practice of writing about emotionally difficult experiences with specific attention to the meaning and the emotional content, shows consistent positive outcomes for psychological health and for behavioral change. The mechanism involves the linguistic processing of emotional experience, which appears to support the integration of memory and emotion in ways that reduce rumination and increase the clarity of self-understanding. David's practice of self-interrogation after significant experiences is a non-written version of this same process, and it appears to serve similar functions for him. The key variable is not the writing specifically, but the commitment to honest examination of one's own experience without the defensive filtering that most people apply. Let me now address the question of inner dialogue directly, because this is where I think today's conversation has its most universal and most immediately applicable content. Every human being has a continuous internal dialogue. Research estimates that we produce somewhere between 6,000 and 60,000 thoughts per day, with the higher estimates encompassing the background noise of automatic mental activity that most people are barely aware of. And the character of that inner dialogue, its content, its tone, its relationship to your actions and your sense of self, is one of the most powerful determinants of behavioral and life outcomes available to study. David's inner dialogue is different from most people's, not because he was born with a different one, but because he has spent years intervening in it deliberately and systematically. He describes the voice in his head that used to tell him he was not enough, was not capable, was not worthy of the things he was reaching for. That voice was the voice of a childhood that had told him those things through word and circumstance in ways that left neurological traces. It was real. And ignoring it or telling it to shut up, the approach most motivational advice recommends, does not work. What David learned to do instead was to argue back, to confront the voice with evidence. When the inner voice says, "You cannot do this," you respond with a specific memory of something you did that the voice said you could not do. When it says you are not strong enough, you respond with a specific record of what your strength has actually produced. You build over time a counter-narrative that is not optimistic in the empty sense, but is specifically evidenced. And because it is evidenced, it holds up under pressure in ways that affirmations and positive self-talk do not, because it is true. The neuroscience of self-talk has actually been studied directly. Research by Ethan Cross at the University of Michigan on self-distancing, the practice of addressing oneself in the third person during moments of self-directed speech, has shown that third-person self-talk produces measurably reduced emotional reactivity during difficult tasks and improved performance compared to first-person self-talk. The mechanism appears to involve the creation of psychological distance from the emotional content of the self-evaluation, which reduces amygdala activation and preserves prefrontal capacity for the task at hand. David has developed his own version of this through what might be called adversarial self-dialogue, engaging the inner critic not with agreement or avoidance, but with counter-evidence and direct challenge. The effect is similar, a reduction in the automatic behavioral control that the critical inner voice would otherwise have. Let me now address the concept that I think is most important and most practically transferable from David's experience, which is the concept of becoming someone who is always in construction. David does not describe himself as having arrived anywhere. He does not describe his psychological state as one of completion or of having figured it out. He describes himself as someone who is permanently and deliberately in the process of becoming. And this is, in his view, not a consolation for not being done. It is the actual point. The person who believes they have arrived stops growing. They stop confronting. They stop discovering what is past the current edge. And without that confrontation and that discovery, the capacities they have built begin to erode. David continues to train at a level that most people would consider extreme, not because he needs to prove anything to anyone else, but because the practice of going to the edge of his capacity and expanding it is the activity through which he experiences himself most fully. It is, in a sense, his form of aliveness, the neuroscience of continuous challenge and its relationship to psychological vitality is relevant here. Research on the concept of eudaimonia, the Aristotelian notion of flourishing, that psychologists have operationalized as the experience of growth, purpose, engagement, and the realization of one's potential, consistently shows that eudaimonic well-being is associated with continued challenge and growth rather than with the achievement of comfort and safety. People who are engaged in challenging pursuits that match and slightly exceed their current capacity, what Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi has called the flow channel in his work on flow states, report higher subjective well-being, greater sense of meaning, and more positive affect than people operating well within their comfort zone, regardless of the objective circumstances of their lives. David Goggins has, through a combination of extreme experience and systematic self-examination, arrived at a way of structuring his life that puts him in that channel essentially continuously. And what is remarkable is that the path he took to get there was not a path that most people would have chosen. It ran directly through everything he feared, and everything he had been told was too much for him. That is not a coincidence. It is the mechanism. The practical takeaways from today's conversation that I want to leave you with are the following. The accountability mirror practice: begin immediately, not next week, not when you feel ready. Stand in front of a mirror and have the honest conversation. Write the specific things that are true about where you are that you would rather not face, and write the specific behaviors that address each one. Not goals, behaviors. Not lose weight, run 4 days this week, not improve my finances, track every expense for 30 days. The specificity is what makes it actionable. The honesty is what makes it real. The callousing practice: identify one area of your life where you have been avoiding discomfort and make deliberate, consistent, graduated contact with that discomfort. The content is less important than the consistency. Whatever makes you slightly uncomfortable in a productive way, do it regularly. Note what changes over time in your relationship to that specific discomfort, and then extend the practice to the next area. The cookie jar practice: build your inventory now. Write down the 10 most difficult things you have ever survived or accomplished. Be specific. Access one of those memories the next time you are in a difficult moment and feel the pull to quit. Use your own evidence rather than someone else's inspiration. The inner dialogue practice: begin listening to the voice that tells you to stop, to back off, to protect yourself from difficulty. Identify it specifically as the governor. And then argue with it using evidence, not with affirmations, with specific memories of what you have already done that contradict what the governor is claiming about you. And finally, embrace the permanent construction. Stop waiting to be finished. Stop treating growth as something that ends when you reach the goal. David Goggins, at 50 years old, is still training, still confronting, still discovering what is past the edge he last found, not because he has not achieved enough, because he has found the thing that most people spend their whole lives looking for without finding it: a relationship with himself that is honest enough, disciplined enough, and alive enough to keep generating growth indefinitely. That relationship is available to every person listening today. The path to it is the same one David took, which is to turn and face what you have been avoiding, to have the honest conversation you have been postponing, and to begin not at the right moment, now. The key takeaways from today: David Goggins built his psychology not despite his circumstances, but through the systematic, honest confrontation of them. The accountability mirror is the foundational practice, a daily, specific, unsparing, honest inventory of where you actually are and concrete behavioral commitments that address that reality. The 40% rule reflects real neuroscience. The brain's regulation of effort systematically underestimates actual physiological and psychological capacity, and developing the practice of pushing past the perceived limit reveals available capacity that was always there. Callousing the mind through deliberate, repeated exposure to discomfort is neurologically grounded in the same mechanisms as systematic desensitization, and it produces a generalized reduction in the power of discomfort to control behavior. The cookie jar provides evidence-based self-efficacy in moments of maximum difficulty by making past mastery experience immediately accessible. The governor is the brain's threat management system disguised as wisdom, and learning to identify it as such is a prerequisite for accessing capacity beyond the perceived limit. Inner dialogue is trainable, and the most effective intervention is counter-evidence, not affirmations. And the permanent construction mindset, the commitment to never treating growth as finished, is both the mechanism and the reward of everything David has built. All of the research and researchers mentioned today are linked in the description below. David's books, Can't Hurt Me and Never Finished, are also linked. If you found today's episode valuable, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for your time. And as always, thank you for your interest in science. I want to add several more dimensions to what we covered today because there are aspects of David Goggins' philosophy and the neuroscience underlying it that deserve deeper treatment. Let me go into the specific neuroscience of what happens to a person who has experienced the kind of childhood trauma David experienced and then undertakes the kind of systematic self-confrontation and physical challenge that he undertook. Because this is not just an inspiring story. There is a specific neurobiological mechanism by which the work David did rewired his nervous system. And understanding that mechanism is important for anyone who has experienced significant early adversity and wonders whether change is genuinely possible. The concept I want to introduce here is post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth is a term coined by psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun to describe the positive psychological change that can emerge from the struggle with highly challenging life circumstances. It is importantly different from resilience, which is the ability to bounce back to baseline after adversity. Post-traumatic growth is the emergence of psychological capacities that did not exist before the adversity. It is growth past the prior baseline rather than return to it. Research on post-traumatic growth has identified several consistent domains in which growth occurs. Personal strength, meaning the recognition of capacities within oneself that were not previously known. New possibilities, meaning the discovery of new paths and directions that the adversity made visible. Relating to others, meaning deeper empathy and connection with other people who have suffered. Appreciation for life, meaning a changed sense of what matters and what does not, and spiritual or existential change, meaning a deepened engagement with questions about meaning and purpose. David Goggins demonstrates post-traumatic growth in essentially all of these domains, and the mechanism by which post-traumatic growth occurs, according to Tedeschi and Calhoun's model, is relevant to how David achieved it. The key variable is what they call deliberate rumination, which is the conscious directed re-examination of the traumatic experience and its meaning. This is different from intrusive rumination, which is the involuntary, distressing re-experiencing of traumatic memories that characterizes PTSD. Deliberate rumination is the intentional return to the experience with the goal of understanding it, integrating it, and extracting meaning from it. David's practice of deep self-reflection, of going back into the experiences of his childhood and his military service and his physical failures with the specific intention of understanding them rather than avoiding them, is a form of deliberate rumination. And the research suggests that this specific cognitive practice is one of the primary mechanisms by which post-traumatic growth occurs. There is also a relevant body of research on what is called voluntary adversity and its psychological effects. Research has examined the psychology of people who voluntarily undertake extremely difficult physical challenges, including ultramarathons, military special operations training, and high-altitude mountaineering. What emerges consistently is that voluntary adversity, meaning difficulty that the person has chosen rather than had imposed on them, has different psychological effects than the same level of difficulty when it is imposed externally. The sense of agency, the experience of having chosen this challenge is central to the psychological benefit. It converts the experience from something happening to you into something you are doing, which changes the meaning and the psychological processing of the difficulty entirely. This is one reason why David's explicit emphasis on choice is so central to his philosophy. He chose to stand in front of that mirror. He chose to lose 106 pounds. He chose to go back to BUD-S after failing. He chose the ultramarathons. At every step, the choice was his. And that accumulation of chosen difficulty is fundamentally different in its psychological effect from the unchosen difficulty of his childhood, not because the difficulty was less, but because the agency was his. I also want to address something about David Goggins that I think is genuinely important and that gets overlooked in the popular coverage of his story. He has been extraordinarily honest about the costs of the life he has built. His marriage did not survive the demands of his military career and his relentless pursuit of physical extremity. His relationships have been strained by the same intensity that makes him extraordinary. He has experienced physical damage, including kidney issues from dehydration during extreme events, joint damage from the accumulated trauma of decades of running and training on injured tissue, and cardiovascular consequences from the extremity of his training protocols. He is not a simple success story, and he does not present himself as one. He is a complete human being who has made extraordinary choices and paid real prices for them, and whose honest accounting of those prices is as important to understanding him as his extraordinary achievements. This matters because the goal is not to produce David Goggins. The goal is to use the principles he has discovered and demonstrated to produce more of who you are capable of being. The specific form that takes will look different for every person, and the level of physical extremity involved will be different, and the prices paid will be different. What transfers is not the specific program. What transfers is the framework, the honest self-confrontation, the systematic contact with discomfort, the evidence-based inner dialogue, the permanent construction mindset, the conversion of past hardship into present fuel. Let me also address the question of how the practices David uses relate to the clinical literature on trauma treatment, because I think there are important points of both convergence and divergence that are worth being precise about. The gold standard treatments for post-traumatic stress disorder include prolonged exposure therapy, developed by Edna Foe and colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania, and cognitive processing therapy, developed by Patricia Resick and colleagues. Both of these treatments involve some form of deliberate confrontation with traumatic memories in a controlled, therapeutic context, combined with cognitive work to identify and modify the distorted beliefs about the self and the world that often develop in response to trauma. David's self-confrontation practice has structural similarities to these approaches. It involves return to difficult memories with the intention of extracting meaning and changing their emotional valence. But it differs in important ways, primarily in the absence of a therapeutic relationship and therapeutic structure, and in the role that physical challenge plays in his process, for which there is not a direct clinical analog. This is not a criticism of David's approach. It is important context for anyone listening who is dealing with significant trauma. The research-supported clinical treatments for trauma are genuinely valuable and genuinely effective, and they are appropriate for people for whom the level of traumatic impact is such that self-guided approaches are insufficient. David has not had the benefit of formal trauma treatment, as far as I know. What he has done is essentially construct his own process, one that has been extraordinarily effective for him, but that has also required him to carry significant weight alone in ways that formal therapeutic support would have helped distribute. For anyone who is carrying significant trauma, I would encourage both the self-development practices David describes and access to evidence-based therapeutic support if the trauma is significantly impacting your functioning. I want to close with something that I think is the deepest layer of what David Goggins has built and that I have been building toward throughout this conversation. It is the question of identity. What David has done at the most fundamental level is build a completely new identity out of the wreckage of the one he was given. He was given the identity of a child who was not enough, a child who was incapable, a child who was invisible, who was expendable, whose needs did not matter, whose existence was a burden rather than a gift. He was given that identity through years of sustained systematic communication from the people and the environment that surrounded him in his most formative years. And he refused it. Not immediately, not easily, not without going through years in which that identity had significant power over him. Years of the 2, 9, 7-pound exterminator who was lost and depressed and eating his feelings. He refused it through the specific, sustained, repeated practice of choosing differently, choosing to look honestly rather than away, choosing to return rather than quit, choosing to go past the point where every prior version of himself had stopped. Each of those choices was a vote for a different identity. And over thousands of such choices, over decades of such choosing, the identity changed. Not because he thought differently, because he behaved differently, repeatedly and consistently, and in the face of everything that was telling him the old identity was the real one. The research on identity change supports exactly this mechanism. Psychologists who study how identities change over time have found that identity change is not primarily driven by insight or by a shift in beliefs. It is driven by the accumulation of behavioral evidence that is inconsistent with the prior identity. You cannot think your way to a new identity. You behave your way there. David Goggins stood in front of a mirror with 297 pounds and a history of abuse and failure and poverty and racism and told himself the truth. And then he did something about it. And then he did it again and again. And the person who stands in front of mirrors today, who has run over 70 ultramarathons, who has served his country for 20 years, who has helped millions of people around the world discover that they are more than they believe, that person was built, vote by vote, through the accumulation of choices made in the direction of who he had decided to become. That is the deepest lesson and the most transferable one. And it begins, as it always has for David, with a mirror and an honest question. What is actually true right now, and what am I going to do about it? Thank you for your time, and as always, thank you for your interest in science.